Welcome to this Fane online event. I'm Lily and I'm here with Mya-Rose to talk about her wonderful new book, Birdgirl, and all the thinking and work, I guess, that goes on in the kind of background of making a book like this. So yeah, so lovely to see you. It's been quite a few years.
You too, yeah.
Yeah. First of all, you just come from Cambridge, where you are now studying social political science. Is that right?
That's true, yeah. I'm just about to finish my second year at the moment. So.
And how's that going?
It's very good, actually. I think a lot of people are very surprised that I didn't go off and do sort of biology or zoology, because I've always loved nature. But I think actually, like a lot of the campaigning I've done over the years has made me realise that I'm really interested in people, so I really enjoy it.
Yeah. I was supposed to study, I got a place at Cambridge as well to study the exact same course, social political science. I ended up switching to art history at the last minute. And there was still always a part of me that's, when I was at university and also afterwards, was often like, oh, maybe I should have stuck with it. It seems like a fascinating course. And to me, it actually doesn't seem surprising at all that you've done that course, because actually a lot of your work, from what I've seen of it, has got a very kind of political, socially engaged lens. So it sort of makes sense that you would study.
Yeah, thank you. I take that.
Space.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, everything always feels incredibly political, even when sort of other people can't understand why it would feel that way. Like even sort of my love of nature and birds, and sort of enjoyment of the outdoors has always felt like it has sort of a political aspect to it all. You know, considering we are in an era of various environmental crises.
And so starting with the kind of, the political dimension, maybe for people who are not familiar with your work, can you speak a little bit about the kind of origin of your activism and the organisation you founded, Black to Nature?
Yeah, so I have probably been campaigning since I was about 11 years old. And I think looking back, it was very much, I suppose because I'm 20 and I think I am of the generation that has always been just incredibly aware of all the political and environmental issues going on around the world, like climate change. And I think I sort of got to an age where I was like, none of the grown-ups seem to be doing anything about it. No one seems to care. And I felt like I cared so much that it sort of was pouring out of me. And so that sort of, I guess I used that, and that became campaigning. And that took various different forms to do with, my very first one was to do with an oil spill in Bangladesh, where my family's from. But my biggest campaign over the years has been my charity, Black to Nature. And I set that up because for me, as someone who was not white, existing in that sort of environmental nature space, it seemed incredibly obvious that there was a diversity problem or an engagement problem, or that something was going wrong, because it was so totally white and middle class. And so I set up Black to Nature originally as a very grassroots way to sort of bring kids out of the city, in particular focusing on kids from Black and Asian communities, and helping them engage with nature and the outdoors, both because I knew from personal experience just how important having that connection with nature is for, you know, mental and physical well-being, but also sort of with the hope that with more people sort of falling in love with nature and the outdoors, they might also want to save it.
And how old were you when you set it up?
I was 13.
Wow.
I think also sort of when I was much younger, before we sort of started exploring the very systemic institutional aspects of this, it probably also came from almost like a very childish desire to share the thing that I really loved with other kids as well.
And when you encountered it as being a very kind of white middle class environment, as you say, the conservation world, can you maybe speak to that experience? Like, in what way did you encounter that? Like, how did you first kind of think through that as a problem?
Yeah, I think it was everything, and it had always been like that. It was only as I started to get a bit older, you know, as someone who wasn't white, and my mum is Bangladeshi and stuff like that, that I realised that I literally never saw anyone who looked like me or looked like my family. And you know, there was just this sense, both sort of within these environmental spaces, but also actually in sort of Asian community, like in terms of my family and stuff like that. And it was always this narrative of environmental stuff is a white people thing. And I was like, I had started to sort of see the way that climate change was affecting my family in Bangladesh and things like that. I had seen enough birds all over the world that I could see how, like, you know, it made no sense to me. And so it was, again, almost from my own personal experience, where sort of I had these people saying like, oh, you know, there are just certain types of people who aren't interested in these things. And I just sort of think, but what about me? I'm interested in these things, so it means that other people can be too.
And just to be clear, like, what were when you say these spaces, you were like working with different conservation organisations?
Yeah.
Or like, what was the encounters you were having? Because most 12, 13-year-olds, as you know, are not having encounters with the kind of conservation world. So I'm curious how that was kind of happening in your life. Your dad's a birder, so presumably that was introducing you to these different spaces. Maybe if you could speak.
Yeah, I mean, I was spending a lot of time growing up just in the countryside, so like lots and lots of nature reserves and, you know, middle of nowhere kind of spots, and basically anywhere where you see birds. I probably spent some time as a kid. Just sort of, there is a very big birdwatching community in the UK as well, so there were also like groups of people that we were seeing who were all basically middle-aged white blokes, but also, yeah, sort of spending time within sort of the nature sector with various nature organisations, you know, like the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust, as well as sort of environmental organisations. It was basically everywhere and everything. And at the time, when I first started, it made people very, very uncomfortable actually to have conversations around race and racism, because they saw themselves as a very liberal sphere actually, and sort of even a vague accusation that there may be sort of systemic racism within these spaces was very upsetting to people who existed in a sector where they couldn't even consider that, you know, they might be racist. And so it was really difficult sort of starting.
And do you think it's also a class issue? And I say that because I grew up in London in a kind of like very poor family, to put it bluntly, and I also didn't have any, I didn't have a lot of exposure to nature, and it's sort of been like mind opening as I get older, and you're like, oh, the countryside, like, and I feel like unfair on my family because they did take me on camping trips. So it's not that they didn't do anything, but it was just like, as a city kid, you're sort of in the city and you haven't got that same exposure. And I wonder if I'm less familiar with obviously the racial dynamics, but I wonder how that also intersects with the economic kind of class dynamics as well.
Yeah, I think that definitely there is something at play, which is kind of why I was talking about it being white middle class, because I think both of those aspects are very important. And I think in the UK, spending time in the countryside in particular is something that is reserved for the white middle class, and basically has been since like the Industrial Revolution, when suddenly, you know, all the poor people were stuck in the city. And you can see that even in terms of like examining the green spaces in different areas of the cities, where if you're living in sort of the very well-to-do places, it means your local parks and things like that are very beautiful with hedges and flowers, versus like, you know, if you're living in more working class areas, it's very often like literally just like a patch of grass. And so it is sort of, I think that actually access to nature in the UK is a privilege. And the work that I was doing in particular was sort of focusing on the racial dynamic, just because sort of on top of this class issue that was going on, there was also just massive communities of people who sort of had it, who felt themselves that they were like culturally urban communities, who had no interest in spending time in the outdoors or connecting with nature or doing any of that kind of thing, even though like even a generation or two previously, their parents, grandparents were very often living in very rural places. And so it's sort of breaking down the barriers and showing people that actually anyone, or no, more than anyone, can spend time in nature. It's important that everyone should spend time in nature.
And through that work you did, and through Black to Nature, what did you see? Did you see people's attitudes shift? What are the kind of stories from that time?
It's amazing actually. Like, I think that, and we've worked with hundreds of kids now, possibly more than that, and every single one of those kids has engaged with nature in some shape or form. And especially at the beginning, when people maybe like didn't know Black to Nature or weren't quite sure what they were signing up for, we'd have like especially teenagers going like, oh, I don't want to be here, don't want to do this. But there would always be something, and there's been so many magical moments over the years. So I think that side of things is amazing, and now we have kids who come back over and over again as well. But I think also on top of that, there has been such a big institutional shift in terms of the conversations around race and racism. You have whole sectors that are now examining their relationships with racism and how they can maybe engage people from ethnic minority communities. But even in terms of like the climate change conversation, I think sort of the younger generations have massively brought in all these conversations around sort of intersectionality and global climate justice and things like that, that I think actually connects with a lot more people and shows how environmentalism is relevant to everyone from all different parts of the world.
Yeah, so you feel optimistic maybe?
I do. Like I think there's a long way to go, but I think you know, things are shifting in the right direction. And also Black to Nature, we were like, it was like 7 years ago now when I set it up, and we were basically like a lone wolf at the time, versus like various other organisations have sprung up since then, especially post-pandemic actually, you know, when all the green spaces were locked in the cities. And I think a lot of people who never would have said, you know, they were a nature person were suddenly like, oh, actually, I need to be able to spend time outdoors.
And now tell me so about birding. So why do you love birds so much, and how did they enter your reality and your life so centrally?
Yeah. I mean, I talk in the book about like, I was bird watching when I was a newborn, basically. Like I've been doing it my whole life.
I didn't realise that actually because we've met obviously in the past.
Yeah.
Until I read the book, I hadn't realised that your parents were both birders. Your father, and then the influence you had on your mother.
Yeah.
And so you were sort of reared in a birding family.
Yeah, and it was kind of, I probably didn't realise until I was a bit old, like maybe when I started primary school, that not everyone has a relationship with birds in some shape or form, just because they were so like intrinsic to my life. And I'm watching them constantly, like even like when I'm chatting to my friends or something, they'll sort of see my eyes slide slightly past their head, and they'll know that I've just spotted a bird behind them.
And why do you think there is a culture obviously of bird watching, even if it is niche? Why do you think birds of all the different animals in the planet have had this kind of particular magnetism to this kind of community of people, including yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are incredibly beautiful, and I think something about animals being able to fly is always going to capture the human imagination in some shape or form. Like culturally, birds are very important to us, but I think also, like, birds are just everywhere, you know? Like I think when you're talking about nature, and very often how people feel like you have to go into the countryside to see nature, I don't think birds are part of that. Like you'll be walking down any street in London, even if it's a pigeon or a seagull, there are birds, you know? And so I think it's the fact that they are very present in our life, you know? Like, it's
the most present wildlife, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's such an easy gateway into getting into nature in general. And I think there is just something like they have a deeply human appeal, and I think it's very difficult to explain. But on top of all of that, you know, I talk in the book a lot actually about my family, and I think one of the reasons that birds are and continue to be very special for me above other types of nature is because they do almost represent family to me, in that they were absolutely a tool that my family and I used sort of to manage and cope during very difficult times when I was like younger and a teenager. And so I think, and they were sort of how I spent time with my parents actually as well. Like even when things were really tough, we'd go bird watching together. And so I think sort of just total love of nature and the outdoors combined with sort of those very precious memories, I think has created some animals that are very special to me.
Yeah, I was surprised actually how kind of open and personal the book is. Was that a difficult decision to you know, you write about your mum's mental health issues and various different kind of dynamics in the family, that your sister getting pregnant when she's very young, like was it challenging to do that, to go through that process, or did you always feel it was important to be honest and your family were very supportive of that?
It was terrifying actually, and because the original idea for Birdgirl really was I wanted to write a book about birds, because especially because I've spent my whole life sort of with people going like, but why birds? Why bird watching of all hobbies? Especially like as a teenage girl. And so I wanted to write a book where someone could read it and, you know, they could understand how someone could fall in love with birds. And it was only sort of as I was plotting it all out that I realised that a lot of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of birds made no sense without much more personal context, especially in terms of my mum being very mentally ill and having bipolar disorder and sort of the struggles that my family went through because of that. And so sort of I had this realization that it needed to be in there, and that it was really scary. And I remember I went and talked to my mum just to ask if she would even be okay with it. And weirdly, at that point, she was more enthusiastic about the idea than I was, just in that, like, she talked to me and she was like, we need to tell the story really honestly if we're going to tell it, sort of warts and all. And I think for her, sort of the idea of putting out very honest representation and sort of breaking down some of these barriers just felt very important to her. I think mainly because she never saw anything like that, and she never saw herself reflected in any books. And so, it became sort of what it is now.
And what's the influence of publishing it? It was published last year, if I'm correct. What's been the influence on you and on your family? Has it been like a healing process, or like how's it felt to put that into the world?
Yeah, God, I remember like when I was about halfway through writing this book, I saw something online, and it was like, if you're writing a book for catharsis, stop writing it and just go to therapy instead. And I was like, too late, I've started writing it now. Like, because it was an incredibly cathartic writing process. We talked about a lot of things that we basically hadn't talked about since it happened, and I think a lot of healing happened because of that. And I think the really lovely thing actually sort of post-publication is seeing other people's reactions to the book, because like, again, I think none of us come across, like, there are certain moments where all of us probably look a bit bad because that's just the reality of life, and sort of having people come up and sort of be so incredibly positive about the stories that we're telling. I think one in particular that really sticks with me was like this 17-year-old South Asian girl who was just talking about sort of the way that I talk in the book about sort of mental health and how that's talked about in South Asian communities in particular. She said was like so similar to her own personal life and the things that she dealt with her family. And it's sort of it's feedback like that it kind of reminds me why I've put so much of myself out into the world in that way, because you know it is really special.
And what next? Like, what do you think? You're in your second year of university, so you've got 1 year left.
Yeah.
And do you have a sense of what you want to do afterwards? Sorry, is that a really...
No, it's okay. It's probably a very valid question. I kind of don't know, but there are lots of things that I'm doing now that I do definitely want to continue. Like, for example, not to be obvious, but I think birds and birdwatching are always going to be part of my life in some capacity. I don't know, I could watch birds for a job, that would be lovely. But I think also like a lot of my campaigning and things like that is incredibly important to me, and unfortunately I suspect that in like 18 months time we'll still need to be talking about all of these things. So I think also continuing that. In the short term, I actually have another book coming out in the summer.
You do? Wow.
Yeah, very different to this one. I wrote it right afterwards, and it was like lovely because it is a kids book called Flight, like an illustrated kids book about bird migration coming out in June. I'm very excited. That was so fun to write, and like I kept on getting emails
So for children?
Yeah, like I'd say probably like 5 or 6
and
plus.
Like showing their migration routes or something?
Yeah, so it's 7 different birds from around the world and following their migration north to south, and just lots of like fun stories and fun facts. I found out so much about like what people used to think about migration. Like people didn't know that birds used to migrate, so they thought that maybe they'd fly to the moon in the winter time, or maybe they hibernated under the mud and stuff like that. They really didn't know where they went. And also one of the birds that I follow is a hummingbird. And people used to think that hummingbirds weren't big enough to be making these giant journeys on their own. So they used to think that maybe they hitched rides on the back of geese, which are obviously very famous for migrating. But it was really fun. It was just very nice to just write about birds.
And am I right in understanding that a lot of the migration routes are still somewhat of a mystery? how they know the roots, how they can kind of remember where. Same with other animals, turtles, blah blah blah. But that it's somewhat of a kind of extraordinary mystery that we don't fully understand how they have these landscapes mapped, and they pass it on genetically.
It is, like it's strange actually. So much of migration is a mystery still, like in terms of how they know to do it and things like that. But also for a lot of birds, we actually just don't know where they go still, or at least if we have sort of a destination on either end, we don't know where they're flying and things like that. And I don't know, like it's very easy to sort of feel like we know everything about the animal kingdom now, and we just totally don't. There's still so much more to learn.
I actually have a hummingbird tattoo on my back.
Oh, amazing. I love hummingbirds
Hummingbirds so much. And I got it many years ago when I read about a community in South America, indigenous community, who use different animals as kind of, I hope I'm going to remember exactly right, but this is my memory of it, use different animals as representative of different kind of states of consciousness. So an eagle, a serpent, jaguar, and the hummingbird. And the hummingbird, if I remember right, was this kind of connection between the divine, which was more the eagle consciousness, and then the more like earthly consciousness. And it was kind of based on the fact that, hummingbirds often fly so far, and seemingly like not only they have the route mapped, but they also seem to have this like faith that they will find everything they need along the way, that there will always be the water, the sustenance, etc. And so I thought it was quite a beautiful,
that is beautiful
symbol
actually,
of faith in a way.
And I see that in hummingbirds actually. I think there is just something
they're so
almost
beautiful.
otherworldly about
They're
them.
So beautiful, yeah.
Like, and I love it as well actually, because bird scientists are often like sort of very, very scientific when they're naming birds. So it'll be like the brown thrush or something like that. And then all of the hummingbird names are so beautiful. You're suddenly getting into like sunbeams and empresses and nymphs and all that sort of thing. And I like to think that even the scientists are sort of like stopped and saw the beauty. Yeah.
Will you share some of your favourite like birding stories of encounters with birds?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about like when I fell in love with hummingbirds, because it's still one of my favourite bird watching moments ever. It was when I was about 8 years old, and it was my family and I were going to Ecuador for 3 weeks basically, and my mum had been very depressed the winter before, so it was very up in the air whether we should even be going on this trip. Like it sort of felt like everyone was telling us it wasn't the right thing to do, but sort of as a family we felt like it absolutely was. And so we're sort of going into this trip very nervous and all of this sort of thing. And I remember just sitting on the plane and going through all of the illustrations and like picking out all the best, coolest, prettiest birds I wanted to see. And one of them was this bird called a sword-billed hummingbird. So it's got this bill that's like more than double the length of its body. It's crazy.
I think you have a picture of it in here,
I do,
right?
actually, yeah.
I remember, yeah.
And I just, like, I saw the illustration of it and I was like, that is so cool. Like, I need to see that bird. And the very first evening, we arrived at our lodge and they had all of these feeders strung up in the garden. And I was always so jealous, actually, that in the Americas, you just get hummingbirds as garden birds when we get, like, wrens and blue tits.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't know if you can see that.
Yeah,
clearly.
I don't know. And yeah, I just remember like there were all of these hummingbirds, and they're all like jewel tones as well, like sort of emerald greens and sapphire blues and all that kind of thing, just sort of buzzing around. And then like suddenly this like emerald green bird with the ridiculously long bill just sort of flew into the garden and started sort of very delicately sipping at the feeders, and I was just mesmerized. I was totally in love. I was like, this is incredible, this is amazing. I was sat there for way too long, and I remember sort of running off to my parents afterwards, and I was just like, hummingbirds are amazing, I want to see all of them. Which I'm working on it.
That part I don't fully understand actually with the bird watching community, this idea of kind of needing to see them all, of like counting. And I've fallen in love with birds multiple times, like I definitely understand the love. I've fallen in love with other animals too. Like I just think encountering wildlife can be so magical. But I'm curious, that aspect of the birding community that feels more like competitive or like tick boxing, like what's your thoughts on that? And do you have that in you, like this desire to like see every bird, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved a good like goal. Like I've always, like since I was a kid, I've always loved sort of making these grand statements. And I think like different people have different opinions on it. So for some people it is all about the numbers. It's like I need to have seen this many. I think for me personally, I enjoy thinking about the numbers because they are all sort of very representative of, like, you know, it represents all of the birds that I've seen, and that's really cool. And for me, sort of trying to see new birds isn't about like trying to make that number go up. It's the fact that I want to see new birds because they're really cool, and there's loads of really rare ones and stuff like that. But yeah, some people get very obsessive about it, I guess, including me actually. Sorry, I'm saying that like it's other people somewhere else. Definitely me and my family as well. But I think as well, like I think in the past, sort of the instinct to sort of number and categorize and all that kind of thing is like a very traditional part of bird watching. It almost reminds me of sort of fishing and those kind of hobbies. And so like a lot of the time when I'm trying to get other people into bird watching, like a lot of the things I'm talking about is like you don't necessarily even need to know what you're looking at. You don't need binoculars. Like I think for me the spirit of, or the goal of bird watching is just to spend time outside surrounded by nature and enjoy it, like sort of suck it all in. Like, because, you know, like I'm...
Have you ever gotten bored?
Oh, all the time, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I think, and this is probably one of the reasons I love it as well, but also as a kid it drove me nuts. Like, one of the aspects of birding is you do have to sit and you do have to wait, and like I've always been...
And in the UK that's like probably quite often a cold, wet experience.
Oh yeah, like getting soggy is always part of it, or not very often.
Yeah.
And like, you know, like I've always been really bad at sort of all the yoga and meditation and mindfulness and all those kind of things, and I do genuinely think that bird watching is my version of mindfulness, where like I do go outside, I do switch my brain off a little bit, and you just wait. And like what drove me crazy as a kid was all the waiting, but I think actually as an adult I've grown to really appreciate all of the sort of waiting and the patience, which is probably the most adult thing I've ever said, God. But I do, especially sort of during the pandemic, I just spent, like, you know, I was really lucky. I have a really lovely garden, and I spent a lot of time just sitting, and it was really nice.
What do you feel, well, like not feel, what do you know about the kind of rates of endangered birds, maybe in the UK to begin, you know, like where are we at? How threatened are different species? Is that getting worse right now or better? Yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of paint that picture a bit.
Yeah.
And what are the main threats to those birds?
I think it surprises a lot of people when I talk about how the UK is one of the worst countries in the world in terms of biodiversity and biodiversity loss. The quality of our nature is really, really bad, even compared to, you know, we're always talking about sort of the Amazon getting chopped down and all that kind of thing, which obviously is terrible, but people kind of don't talk about the fact that all of our forests got chopped down several hundred years ago. And, you know, in the last 50 years, we've lost about 38 million birds, actually. Things are quite bad.
So sorry, so again, in the last 50 years, we've lost about 38 million birds.
Yeah.
As in 38 million, as in like the number of the species has gone down.
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of sort of...
In the UK?
Mass, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's like half the human population.
Yeah, actually it's a lot of birds. And I think like the weird thing about like species being endangered is we're so often relying on like anecdotal evidence, like our parents or grandparents being like, oh, we used to get these all the time and now we don't.
And are there any that have gone extinct or are close to being extinct in the UK, species?
In the UK, not extinct, although we do have a lot of very iconic species that are actually really struggling. So like the nightingale is an example of a bird that is like not doing well these days. But to be honest, the reason that we don't have birds that have gone extinct is just because we don't have that many species, not because the conditions for extinction aren't necessarily being met in the UK. But I think a lot of people assume that what we need to do is sort of bring back ancient woodland and things like that, which is really important, but actually a lot of the issues in the UK are actually to do with things like farmland.
Farmland?
Yeah, which is a really, really important habitat, and it's sort of farming growing more and more intense, so like getting rid of all the edges and the hedges and things like that are causing big problems. And so I think like our instinct with environmental issues is always to be like, humans were so terrible for the planet. And that's not really the problem. It's more that sort of we've developed for so long ways that we can live very healthily alongside nature, and it's only in probably the last century or two that we've sort of pushed those aside for more profit, basically. And so, like, yeah, I'm definitely like not the kind of person who's like, humans are so terrible for nature and the planet. It's more figuring out how to work towards bringing back those spaces that are so important for nature to thrive.
And do you have feelings about like key things that need to happen, both to protect bird species, but also maybe in the kind of bigger environmental picture movement?
Yeah, in terms of sort of bringing back species, it is, like I said, sort of creating those little spaces. So in terms of farming, not having like ginormous fields, but instead having the hedges and allowing the streams to run through and letting the big trees stay in the middle of the, like all that kind of thing is really important. Allowing the soil to sort of
organic
stay healthy
as well, and regenerative farming practices.
Exactly. I am like personally an advocate for rewilding, I think, or whatever you want to call it, allowing nature to return, whether that's sort of planting trees or allowing rivers to sort of go the way that they're supposed to go. There are some really cool rewilding projects in the UK, like beavers are back, and they're so good in terms of flood and drought management, which is really helpful in terms of climate change, but also creating habitats. And I think stuff like that highlights how biodiversity loss and climate change are basically two sides of the same coin. And in order to tackle one, we need to tackle the other. But I think also in general, sort of, I was talking about how people are part of nature, and we can thrive with nature under the right conditions. And I think actually having been able to travel because of all of the bird watching I've done and meet so many people from all over the world along the way, and sort of, especially actually a lot of indigenous communities, who sort of, it's sort of almost this bafflement of like, we can live with nature, why are all of these things happening? And so I think in general, actually, that's why a really important part of my campaigning has been advocating for people from like the global south, like Bangladesh, or from indigenous communities to have more of a voice within the climate change movement, because at the moment it's so dominated by people in the West, which obviously is not helpful in terms of building a movement that actually works for everyone and speaks for everyone.
And how do you think that might shift or could shift?
I think there's so many little things, like if we're looking at sort of the COP conferences and things like that, like I attended COP26, I think you did too, a couple of years ago, and it was, things as simple as how the conversation is dominated by countries like the USA, which is like constantly digging its heels in terms of climate change, but also as simple as I did this panel that was like sort of, it was inside the conference, and it was fairly like high level, and that it got a lot of attention. Greta Thunberg was on the panel, and one of the people on the panel was from South America, and she was indigenous, and she spoke Spanish, and she needed a translator, and in the end the community had fundraised for this translator, even though we were at a literal UN conference. And it's like all of these little things that sort of gather up until suddenly it's so hard to speak up for yourself that it like feels like people just aren't being heard. Like at that same COP, actually, it was like all the youth rights for climate activists who had fundraised to bring in indigenous activists all over the world, not the UN conference again. And so I think it feels like over and over again there's sort of this complete lack of interest in hearing from these people and actually figuring out a path forward that works for the people who are currently on the front lines of climate change.
To my mind, it's again such a like I see it with such an economic lens that, like, having now gone to 2 COPs, the COP26, and then I went to COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh as well, and in both I found it quite disillusioning for different reasons, but it does feel that we're still in a very neo-colonial political framework whereby the countries and the company industry and the industries, but particularly also the countries that have more economic kind of power, muscle that, and the industries muscle that in these conferences in a way that's really problematic. And then that, of course, intersects with race quite often, not always, but quite often, because of the history within which certain countries that are predominantly white have become wealthier. You know, there are exceptions to that, but then you see how those things have kind of mapped together, and it's not like a level playing field.
Yeah, I mean, like, sort of the history of climate change is, in my opinion, also the history of colonialism, and it's so easy to sort of look back at the past and be like, oh, we don't do that anymore, it's okay, but like when things have just shifted or evolved, you know, that doesn't mean they've gone away. And even like something as basic as the fact that Shell bought their oil mining rights in Africa from essentially the British Empire and things like that, and you know, I think we see it over and over again, and it's just
the latest one. Actually, I've been sorry to interrupt me.
No, it's all right.
That I was campaigning on these last few weeks, not campaigning on, but just trying to draw attention to, is BP, originally obviously British Petroleum. I wish they were beyond petroleum. They brand to themselves. It doesn't seem like they've actually actually going beyond petroleum, and they have them and several other companies, but they were the focus of this work I was supporting. Have oil fields in Iraq, and they do a kind of toxic flaring practice that apparently is completely avoidable and creates like highly polluting contaminants in the atmosphere that has been proven to cause high rates of leukemia. And there was a boy who documented this and what was happening in his community, because journalists aren't allowed into that region of Iraq, for the BBC, and they made a BBC documentary, Under Poison Skies. He got leukemia when he was 15, helped contribute to this documentary, and then I was contacted to see if I could help him with a fundraiser because his cancer had come back. This was a few weeks ago, and so we pushed out a fundraiser to try and raise money for him. And then I got the news a week ago, literally a week today, that he died, age 21, so your age, awful. You know, so awful. And then I was just watching yesterday a video of, it was BP's shareholder conference yesterday, and his father, Ali the boy, was supposed to speak at the conference, but died a week ago, so his father spoke instead. And I watched a video of it where he compared cancer to the flu in their region. And anyway, you've got BP pulling back, I don't know if you follow the news, but on their climate commitments in the last few months. And it's just maddening. It's just maddening. And it's so, like, that particular story really humanized it, but also just paints this picture of the kind of colonial history, the inequities, the sacrifice zones that we have, like, all around the world, where certain communities are sort of allowed to be sacrificed.
And it's the constant sort of prioritization of profit over people
and growth, right?
And
endless economic growth.
And it's incredibly frustrating, and I think that is why, I don't know, even for me, like, my activism came from birds and nature and all that kind of thing. That's why I think it has become about people for me, because, you know, like, there are so many people suffering everywhere, and it's you know, it's so easy for you know, it's always like, there's no planet B, you know, we need to save the planet, and it's actually, no, the planet will continue spinning, you know, it's people who are suffering right now, and it's that really, really upsets me. / makes me really angry, actually.
Of course.
Yeah, it's so maddening.
Yeah. I understand that feeling.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, actually, like, I know so many, like, other young people in particular who do, like, all the climate change campaigning, and it's always, like, framed as this sort of heroic young person that steps up and, you know, is doing their best, whatever. And every single person I actually know is so angry all the time at the state of the world, and I don't know anyone who is like, yeah, this is what I love spending my time doing, it's climate change campaigning, you know, like, it's always just like, why do we as young people have to do stuff like this. And even, I don't know, like even for me, like I look back on, and my whole teenagehood was environmental campaigning, and it's so bizarre to think what that could have been otherwise, I suppose. Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is the next generation deserves a better world than that. And I think environmental issues are so frustrating in general because we have the capacity to solve them. It's just like lack of political will, basically.
Yeah. And do you feel part of the youth climate movement? And like, is that something, how allied do you feel, or how kind of connected does that movement feel to you?
Yeah, I will never forget like turning on the news and watching the youth strikes for climate sort of spread, especially across Europe in the very early stages. Because like, I guess for context, like I talk about it a bit in the book, but like I was so shy and awkward and anxious as a teenager, which was like totally like contrasting with like all of the work and the campaigning that I was doing. And like when I was like 13, 14 years old, which I mention only because it sort of shows what a big shift there has been since then, like it was weird and it was nerdy to care about the climate. And then suddenly there was this, you know, Greta Thunberg came along and there was this wave of young people, and for me it felt like such an exciting pivotal moment. And I think it did shift things. I think it sort of made climate change a very key political issue that it was not before. And so I think the youth movement is like so central to all of this, and like I'd like to think that I'm part of it. I don't know.
I wonder at what point somebody doesn't feel like a youth activist, because it's happened to me. I was like doing some kind of activism since I was a teenager as well, and then at some point it's like, oh, I don't think I'm a youth anymore. Like, when does that transition happen?
Oh God, I remember being like 13 and being like, oh, the 18-year-old activists, they're not youth activists anymore, they're just activists. And I'm like, oh my God, that's such like a child thing to say. I don't know.
And do you feel that it's the youth activist movement is, I mean, it's a very subjective, I guess, thing to comment on, but is representative of the wider youth, or does it feel to you that it's kind of a niche within youth? Because you have extremes, right? You have the kind of extreme of the youth activist movement, which has been very vocal and powerful and important. And I mean, I wrote about it in my book too, like I think super significant. But then you also have like trends and data that suggests that like there are also many other youths like shopping like crazy in fast fashion and you know, like not necessarily engaging in the same way with how disconnected do you feel the youth movement is in a way, in terms of the different directions that are being pulled in?
I think the youth movement itself works to be representative, obviously, especially because it's like a lot of it's kids, you know, so the sort of with trials and tribulations of that, but trying, and that's both sort of in terms of class and race and just like, you know, various different aspects of intersectionality. And I think for me personally, actually, I am a big advocate of young people getting involved in the movement, partially because I think it's a source of hope, and I think it really strongly sort of combats the doomism that a lot of people feel. Like I remember there was a study a year or two ago that said over 50% of people my age think that there's no hope for the future, which isn't true. And so I think actually getting involved in circles where people are passionate and do care, are trying to make a difference, really helps. And then on the other side of things, I think there's actually just a lot of people who still feels like climate change is a very distant thing or not really something to do with them. And I think sort of the culture of consumerism is so detached for a lot of people from environmental issues and human rights issues and things like that. And that's actually one of the reasons that I think that environmental communication is so important, because I mentioned earlier that sort of the thing that we're lacking basically is political will, and you change that by getting more and more people on board, which I do think is shifting. But it's sort of like even like a really simple example, where I live in the southwest, we get loads and loads of flooding, and the way that it's sort of reported upon is just like, another winter, another bit of flooding, another neighbourhood swept away, and it's not, climate change is never mentioned. And so I think connecting the dots for people and maybe helping them to realise that it's not something that's happening in sort of a vague distant future, it's happening now and it will only continue to get worse. I think that is really important.
Which reminds me of my last question actually, which is about Bangladesh and the kind of aspect, I guess, of climate injustice that's happening, whereby poorer communities, you know, less developed, developed in quotations, lower income countries are often bearing the brunt of the kind of fallout that we're already seeing of the climate crisis. What's your observations about kind of the impact of the climate crisis in Bangladesh and the next kind of few decades for that country?
Yeah, I mean, I think having family in Bangladesh and sort of hearing about the things happening in Bangladesh was one of the reasons that I was engaging with climate change stuff when I was very young, actually, because I think unlike a lot of other people I knew, it didn't feel like this distant future. Like, I was very aware of how it was affecting people now, and it was as simple as like, or not simple, but it was, you know, stories like from my grandfather's village, like droughts, or the crops were dying, or flooding, so people's homes and their crops were getting swept away. And it was sort of, these days it feels like it's a constant, almost annual thing where something happens. It's also like cyclones getting worse and things like that, and it's awful and it's relentless. And I remember sort of by the time I got to secondary school, I lived in sort of a very white area, so no one had ever really heard of Bangladesh, and the only time it was ever mentioned in school was sort of, you know, like my geography teacher or someone being like, oh yeah, that's a country that's going to be underwater in 10 years' time, you know. You know, there are already millions and millions of climate change refugees in the capital. It's, I think, sort of, except a lot of the small Pacific islands, I think it's one of the worst affected countries in the world in terms of climate change. And I think that's why,
because of sea level rise,
because of sea level rise and temperature change and changing weather patterns, it's basically like all the different aspects of climate change coming in on one place. And it's sort of, for me, one of the reasons that I think highlighting these human stories is so important, and highlighting how they're happening now.
Have you put much kind of time into looking at kind of fashion in Bangladesh, because it's such a big part of the economy there? And you know, and arguably, like, there are like arguments on both sides, right? That like it's a source of empowerment economically to many communities, particularly women and girls, but that it's often in very exploitative practices that is not so empowering. I mean, I don't know loads about it, but I do know that there are factories that are doing it well, and there are factories that are doing it really badly and essentially abusing these women. And you know, you do occasionally, I think that there was an incident recently actually with a massive factory fire and things like that. And I think it is just sort of another example of, or very often is another example of sort of Western exploitation in sort of post-colonial countries. But I do think that sort of having something like that economically is still really important to the country. And so I think it's like so many of these issues, it's not just as simple as saying, let's stop doing it, but sort of figuring out how to make it sustainable and humane, basically. Do you go to Bangladesh ever?
I do. I was actually there over Christmas, which it was amazing. I went there once, obviously. Oh, really?
Yeah, I was working with Professor Mohammed. I'm sure you know his work, because do you know his work? He won the Nobel Peace Prize for microfinance.
Oh, yeah.
He's, I think, quite well known globally, but also particularly in Bangladesh. And so I went there and I was looking at his microfinance initiatives, and I met women in the villages that like run their local banks. Yeah, you know, it's kind of extraordinary. Really cool. And I was looking at social business work with him. It's a very, very interesting experience.
It is. It's. I'm probably biased, but I think it's a really, really special country. And it's very beautiful, actually. And it's sort of like, I guess, to circle right back to the first thing we were saying about sort of back to nature and engaging people with nature and the outdoors. It's like when we're sort of having a lot of the conversations with these teenagers about climate change and things like that, sort of talking about, you know, flooding in the UK and things like that doesn't really engage them, but actually for example, you know, a group of boys whose like grandparents still live in Sudan and things like that, talking about like recent really bad drought that's been happening there and stuff, and connecting that to the idea that it's climate change, that does engage people and that does make them sit up and listen. So I think, I don't know, it's always just helping people to understand why it's important to care now about these issues, but yeah.
And also to, like, what I like about the approach you've taken with Black to Nature, and it's been part of my own journey too, is like the falling in love aspect, you know, that it's not just about fighting to save the planet, in quotations, because it's the right thing to do or a good thing to do or for some future generation or other generation. It's like, no, actually it just could be a better way of living. Like we could actually like feel connected to this like extraordinary diverse planet that we happen to be existing on, you know, like, and actually that could be really magical in and of itself.
I really agree with that, actually. And actually I was talking about earlier how so many people are really angry, and like a lot of that activism is coming from a place of anger. But actually I think sort of activism coming from a place of love is probably so much more powerful, and I think also so much more resilient as well. Like one of the things I worry about a lot is how many young people are really burning themselves out and growing very exhausted for trying to fight for a better future. And so I think sort of, just loving something very deeply and trying to do what's best for it is the best thing. And I think that really does create mental resilience, which is, you know, basically the core theme of Birdgirl, is just how nature makes us resilient and how we need it, in my opinion.
And we are it.
And we are it, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I think that's a perfect way to end, and I couldn't agree more. Birdgirl is available at your favourite local retailer anytime. It was such a pleasure talking to you today.
That was a really lovely chat, thank you.